The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Harris County Courthouse in Houston, Texas. It was 8:45 a.m., and the marble hallways were already buzzing with activity. Lawyers in pressed suits hurried past with briefcases, their shoes clicking against the polished floor. The smell of coffee and paper filled the air, mixing with the building's old wooden scent. Judge Michael Bennett sat in his chambers, reviewing the day's cases. At 62 years old, he had spent the last 15 years building a reputation as one of the strictest judges in the county. His silver hair was always perfectly combed, and his black robe never showed a single wrinkle. He believed strongly in rules and order, often saying that a courtroom without discipline is like a ship without a captain. Looking at his schedule, Judge Bennett frowned at the first case of the day. It was a complicated business dispute between a small local company and a large corporation. He didn't like these cases, which often dragged on too long and cluttered his courtroom with too many lawyers. Meanwhile, across town, Sarah Richardson was having a morning she hadn't planned for. At 45 years old, she had spent 20 years building her law career through hard work and determination. Her office walls held diplomas from the best schools and awards from prestigious legal organizations. But this morning she wasn't thinking about any of that. "Monsieur Richardson," her assistant called out, rushing into her office. "There's an emergency with the Johnson case. The single mother we're helping pro bono. She's outside and crying. Her landlord is trying to evict her today, even though we filed the stay order." Sarah looked at her watch. 8:50 a.m. Her big case in Judge Bennett's court was scheduled for 9 a.m. She had planned to arrive early, knowing the judge's reputation for strictness. Looking at the young mother holding her baby in the waiting room, Sarah knew what she had to do. "Give me 10 minutes with her," Sarah told her assistant, and called the court to let them know she might be a few minutes late. The assistant nodded, but they both knew Judge Bennett's stance on tardiness. He had once fined a lawyer $1,000 for being 5 minutes late, saying, "Punctuality is the respect we show to others' time." Sarah spent the next 15 minutes helping the young mother, quickly making calls to stop the illegal eviction. Her calm voice and confident manner helped settle the distraught woman. This was why Sarah had become a lawyer, to help people who needed it most, regardless of whether they could pay. At 9:05 a.m., Sarah rushed into the courthouse building, her arms full of case files. Her perfectly pressed navy blue suit and pearl necklace still looked immaculate, but she knew being late was not a good way to start the day, especially not in Judge Bennett's courtroom. The courthouse regulars, who knew Sarah, watched her hurry past. Many wanted to warn her about the judge's mood. He had already snapped at 2 people that morning, but she was moving too quickly. Her heels echoed in the hallway as she made her way to courtroom 304. Through the heavy wooden doors, Sarah could hear Judge Bennett's voice. "The court waits for no one." Taking a deep breath, she straightened her spine, adjusted her files, and pushed open the door. The courtroom was full, with at least 30 people seated in the gallery. Her client, a small business owner named James Chen, sat nervously at the defendant's table. The opposing counsel, 3 lawyers from a big firm, smirked as she entered. Judge Bennett looked up from his bench, his steel gray eyes narrowing as Sarah walked in. The clock on the wall read 9:07 a.m. The room fell silent, and the tension grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone who knew Judge Bennett's reputation could sense what was coming. What no one in that courtroom knew, not even Judge Bennett himself, was that this ordinary Tuesday morning was about to become a turning point in both their lives, a moment that would challenge long-held beliefs and ultimately lead to unexpected change in the Harris County legal community. The silence in courtroom 304 felt heavy as Sarah Richardson stood just inside the doorway. Judge Bennett's face grew stern, his jaw tightening as he looked down at her from his raised bench. The morning light from the tall window seemed to dim, as if nature itself sensed the coming storm. "Miss Richardson." Judge Bennett's voice cut through the quiet like a knife. You are exactly 7 minutes late to my courtroom. He glanced at his watch, though everyone knew he didn't need to. Would you care to explain why you think your time is more valuable than the court's? Sarah stepped forward, her posture straight and professional. Your Honor, I sincerely apologize for my tardiness. I had an emergency pro bono client this morning, a single mother facing immediate wrongful eviction. Miss Richardson, Judge Bennett interrupted, his voice growing colder. I don't recall asking for a story about your other clients. This is my courtroom, and in my courtroom, we start at 9 a.m. sharp, not 9:07, not 9:05 to 9:00. He picked up his gavel, tapping it against the wooden sound block. The other lawyers in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Many had seen Judge Bennett be strict before, but something about his tone today felt different, more personal. The three corporate lawyers representing the opposing side exchanged small smirks, clearly enjoying Sarah's discomfort. Sarah's client, James Chen, watched nervously. His small electronics repair business was being sued by a large corporation, and he had hired Sarah because of her excellent reputation. Now, watching the judge's harsh treatment of his lawyer, he felt his hopes sinking. Your Honor, Sarah tried again, her voice calm and steady. I understand the importance of punctuality, and I take full responsibility for my lateness. However, as officers of the court, we sometimes face emergency situations that... That's enough, Miss Richardson. Judge Bennett cut her off again. He leaned forward, his reading glasses sliding down his nose slightly. I'm holding you in contempt of court. The fine is $500 to be paid by the end of business today. A few gasps came from the gallery. Even the court reporter paused, her fingers hovering over her stenograph machine. $500 was an unusually harsh fine for such a minor delay. Sarah stood her ground, maintaining her composure even as she felt the unfairness of the situation. She had been practicing law for 20 years, and had never been treated this dismissively by a judge before. For the record, Your Honor, she said clearly, making sure her words were captured by the court reporter. I would like to state that while I accept the court's decision, I was delayed due to preventing an illegal eviction of a single mother with an infant, which falls under our professional obligation to provide emergency legal services. Judge Bennett's face reddened slightly. Miss Richardson, are you questioning my authority in this courtroom? No, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly. I'm simply ensuring that the record accurately reflects the circumstances. The judge's fingers tightened around his gavel. One more word about this, and I'll double the fine. Now, shall we proceed with today's case, or would you like to continue wasting the court's time? Sarah took her place at the defense table beside her nervous client. She opened her briefcase, removing her carefully prepared documents with steady hands. The corporate lawyers watched her with smug expressions, probably thinking the morning's events had rattled her. But they didn't know Sarah Richardson. Throughout her career, she had faced far worse than an angry judge. She had broken barriers, fought discrimination, and built a reputation as one of the most respected attorneys in Texas. A contempt fine, no matter how unfair, wasn't going to shake her focus from defending her client. As she arranged her papers, Sarah could feel Judge Bennett's critical gaze following her every move. The morning had started badly, but she knew the real battle was just beginning. What no one in the courtroom realized was that, before this day was over, Judge Bennett would learn a powerful lesson about assumptions and prejudice. One that would change not only his perspective, but the entire atmosphere of his courtroom forever. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky as the case began in courtroom 304. Sarah Richardson stood confidently at the podium. Despite Judge Bennett's earlier harsh treatment, Her client, James Chen, watched anxiously as she prepared to present their case. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice clear and professional. "My client, a small electronics repair business, has served this community for 15 years. The plaintiff's claim that we violated their patent is completely unfounded, and we can prove it with clear evidence." Judge Bennett leaned back in his chair, his expression already showing doubt. "Proceed." "Miss Richardson," he said, his tone suggesting he was barely interested in what she had to say. Sarah began explaining their defense, pointing to specific dates and documents. However, barely 2 minutes into her presentation, Judge Bennett interrupted her. "Miss Richardson, get to the point. We don't have all day for lengthy explanations." Sarah took a deep breath, noticing how he hadn't interrupted the corporate lawyers during their 20-minute opening statement. "Your Honor, I'm establishing the timeline which proves my client's innocence. If I may continue, just stick to the relevant facts." Judge Bennett cut in again, waving his hand dismissively. In the gallery, several law students who had come to observe the proceedings were frantically taking notes. They could sense something wasn't right about the judge's behavior, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. Sarah pressed on, her voice never wavering. She pulled out a technical document and approached the bench. "This patent documentation clearly shows that my client's repair method was developed independently 3 years before the plaintiff's patent was even filed." The corporate lawyers jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence wasn't included in the initial discovery." Sarah turned to face them. "If you'll check Exhibit C, page 47, you'll find this document was indeed included. I personally handed it to your office 2 months ago before—" "Wish you could continue," Judge Bennett spoke sharply. "Miss Richardson, in my courtroom, we don't argue with opposing counsel." "Your Honor," Sarah responded respectfully, "I'm not arguing. I'm simply pointing out a factual error in their objection." James Chen watched the exchange with growing concern. He had invested his life savings in his business, and now it seemed like even the judge was against them. But as he watched Sarah handle each interruption with grace and precision, he began to feel a glimmer of hope. Sarah moved on to present their expert witness, Dr. Thomas John, a renowned electronics engineer. As Dr. John began explaining the technical differences between the two repair methods, Judge Bennett's interruptions became more frequent. "Miss Richardson, is all this technical detail really necessary?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied patiently. "The technical details are the heart of this case. They prove that my client's repair method is fundamentally different from the plaintiff's patent." The morning wore on, and Sarah continued to present their case with unwavering professionalism. Despite the judge's constant interruptions and obvious bias, she methodically built their defense piece by piece. Her preparation was thorough, her arguments clear, and her evidence solid. The corporate lawyers grew increasingly uncomfortable. They had expected an easy win, especially after seeing the judge's hostile attitude toward Sarah. Instead, they found themselves facing a masterfully presented defense that was poking holes in their case. During a brief recess, one of the junior corporate lawyers whispered to his colleague, "She's good. Really good. Why haven't I heard of her before?" His colleague shrugged, but an older attorney sitting nearby gave them a knowing look. He had been practicing law in Houston for 30 years and recognized Sarah's name, but he kept quiet. He wanted to see their faces when they finally realized who they were dealing with. As the morning session drew to a close, Sarah had managed to present most of their defense. Despite Judge Bennett's constant interruptions, she had stayed calm, professional, and focused, never once losing her composure or the thread of her argument. What Judge Bennett didn't realize was that his obvious bias was being noticed by everyone in the courtroom. And soon a revelation would come that would make him deeply regret his behavior toward one of the most respected legal minds in Texas. The courthouse cafeteria buzzed with activity during the lunch break. Judge Bennett sat alone at his usual corner table, picking at his chicken salad while reviewing notes from the morning session. He was still irritated about Sarah Richardson's lengthy presentations, though a small voice in his mind wondered why her arguments had bothered him so much. At a nearby table, Mark Thompson, a longtime court clerk, was reading the latest Texas Bar Association newsletter that had just arrived that morning. His eyes widened as he turned to the front page, and he nearly spilled his coffee. "Oh my goodness," he whispered, staring at the headline and color photograph. The front page showed a professional photograph of Sarah Richardson, dressed in an elegant blue suit, standing at a podium. A headline read, "Sarah Richardson makes history. First black woman elected as president of the Texas Bar Association." Mark quickly read the article, his hands slightly shaking. The story detailed Sarah's impressive career. Graduated top of her class from Harvard Law, 20 years of distinguished service, over 500 pro bono cases, founder of the Legal Aid Initiative for Single Parents, and now, the newest president of the Texas Bar Association. Looking up, Mark saw Judge Bennett still sitting alone. After 20 years working in the courthouse, Mark knew he had to do the right thing. He stood up, picked up the newsletter, and walked over to the judge's table. "Your Honor," Mark said quietly, "I think you should see this." Judge Bennett looked up, slightly annoyed at being interrupted during his lunch. "What is it, Mark?" "The new Bar Association newsletter, sir. You might want to read the front page." Judge Bennett took the newsletter, put on his reading glasses, and began to read. His face, usually stern and controlled, slowly changed. First came surprise, then disbelief, and finally something that looked like shock mixed with embarrassment. He read about Sarah's unanimous election by her peers, about how she had argued cases before the Supreme Court, about her work establishing legal clinics in underserved communities, and about her reputation as one of the most respected legal minds in Texas. The chicken salad sat forgotten as Judge Bennett continued reading. The article mentioned how Sarah had recently turned down a federal judgeship to continue her community work, how she had established a scholarship program for minority law students, and how she had written 3 books on constitutional law that were now required reading at several law schools. In his 15 years on the bench, Judge Bennett had prided himself on being fair and professional. But now, remembering his behavior that morning, he felt a deep sense of shame washing over him. "Mark," he said quietly, "how long have you known about this?" "Just read it myself, Your Honor," Mark replied. "But I've heard about Miss Richardson before. She's quite famous in legal circles. They say she's turned down multiple offers to become a federal judge because she believes she can do more good working directly with clients who need help." Just then, 2 young lawyers walked past their table, discussing the morning session. "Did you see how she handled those interruptions?" one whispered. "So professional. I can't believe the judge treated the Bar Association president like that." "Wait, what?" The other lawyer stopped walking. "She's the Bar Association president?" "Yeah. Just elected last month. Youngest president in 30 years. I heard..." Judge Bennett's face grew warm as he heard their conversation. He thought about how he had fined her for being 7 minutes late. Minutes she had spent helping a single mother avoid eviction. How he had repeatedly interrupted her well-prepared arguments, and how he had treated one of the most accomplished attorneys in Texas with such obvious disrespect. Looking at his watch, he saw there were still 20 minutes before court resumed. He stood up, straightened his robe, and headed back to his chambers. He had some serious thinking to do before the afternoon session began. The newsletter sat open on his desk, Sarah Richardson's accomplished smile looking up at him. It was time, he realized, to confront some uncomfortable truths about himself and his behavior. The afternoon session would need to start very differently from how the morning had ended. Judge Bennett sat alone in his chambers, his hands folded on his desk. The Bar Association newsletter lay open before him, Sarah Richardson's photograph seeming to watch him with knowing eyes. The wall clock ticked loudly in the quiet room, counting down the minutes until court would resume. He picked up his phone and called his assistant. "Susan, please pull Miss Richardson's case records from our court system. All of them." 5 minutes later, Susan brought in a surprisingly thin folder. "Your Honor, there aren't many. Miss Richardson rarely appears in our court because she usually handles federal cases and major appeals." Judge Bennett opened the folder and began reading. With each page, he felt increasingly uncomfortable. The few cases she had handled in his court were all pro bono work, helping poor families, elderly veterans, and struggling small business owners. She had won most of them. Despite his now obvious hostile treatment, he opened his laptop and searched for Sarah Richardson's name. The results made him sink deeper into his chair. Articles from legal journals praised her groundbreaking work. Videos showed her giving speeches at national law conferences. Photos captured her shaking hands with Supreme Court justices. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself. A particular video caught his attention. It was Sarah speaking at a law school graduation last year. He clicked play. "The law is not just about rules and procedures." Sarah's voice came through clearly. "It's about justice, fairness, and seeing the humanity in every person who enters our courts. Sometimes the biggest obstacle to justice is not the law itself, but our own unconscious biases." Judge Bennett stopped the video, her words hitting too close to home. He thought about that morning, how he'd find her for being 7 minutes late, minutes she spent helping a desperate mother. How he had interrupted her constantly while letting the corporate lawyer speak freely. How he had dismissed her arguments without really listening to them. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out his personal journal, something he had kept since his first day as a judge. He began to write. "Today, I discovered something ugly about myself. I treated an accomplished lawyer with disrespect, not because of her arguments or behavior, but because of unconscious assumptions I made the moment she walked into my courtroom." He thought about his own daughter, who was in law school. What if someone treated her the way he had treated Sarah today? Standing up, he walked to the window overlooking the courthouse square. People hurried back and forth, returning from lunch. He spotted Sarah sitting on a bench, reviewing papers for the afternoon session, still working despite his unfair treatment. A memory suddenly surfaced from his early days as a lawyer. His mentor, an old judge, had told him, "A good judge listens more than he speaks. A great judge knows when to admit he's wrong." Judge Bennett looked at his watch. The afternoon session would begin in 10 minutes. He had a choice to make. He could pretend nothing had happened and continue as usual, or he could do something that many judges found difficult. Admit his mistake publicly. He thought about all the young lawyers who had been in the courtroom that morning, watching how he treated one of the most respected legal minds in Texas. What lesson had they learned? What example had he set? Turning back to his desk, he pressed the intercom button. "Susan, when court resumes, I'll need to make a statement before we continue with the case." "Yes, Your Honor," Susan replied. "Should I note this in the schedule?" "Yes," he said firmly. "And Susan, please make sure the court reporter is ready. What I have to say needs to be on the record." He straightened his robe and looked in the mirror hanging on his chamber wall. The face that looked back seemed different now. Older, perhaps, but also wiser. In a few minutes, he would walk back into his courtroom and do something that went against every instinct of judicial pride. But first, he had one more thing to do. He picked up his phone and called the court clerk. Please cancel that contempt fine for Monsieur Richardson and prepare the paperwork for a formal apology to be entered into the court record. At exactly 1:30 p.m., the Bey's voice rang out in courtroom 304. All rise. The court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Michael Bennett presiding. The afternoon crowd was larger than the morning session. Word had spread through the courthouse about the morning's events, and many lawyers and clerks had found excuses to be present. The tension in the air was thick as Judge Bennett took his seat. Sarah Richardson sat at the defense table, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. Her client, James Chen, noticed she had a quiet confidence about her that hadn't been there in the morning. Something had changed, but he wasn't sure what. Judge Bennett cleared his throat, adjusted his microphone, and did something unusual. He removed his reading glasses, setting them aside so he could look directly at everyone in the courtroom. Before we continue with today's case, he began, his voice carrying clear through the silent courtroom, I have an important matter to address. He paused, looking directly at Sarah. Miss Richardson, would you please stand? Sarah stood gracefully, her expression curious but composed. The corporate lawyers on the other side shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing something unexpected was about to happen. Miss Richardson, Judge Bennett continued, this morning I treated you with disrespect. I interrupted your arguments, dismissed your explanations, and fined you for being briefly late while helping a client in crisis. His voice was steady, but those who knew him could hear the genuine regret in his words. The courtroom remained absolutely silent. Even the usual shuffle of papers had stopped. I have since learned that you are not only the newly elected president of the Texas Bar Association, but also one of the most respected legal minds in our state. However, he raised his hand slightly. That is not why I'm making this statement. Sarah stood quietly, listening with full attention. In the gallery, several people had pulled out their phones, though court rules prevented them from recording. I'm making this statement because no attorney, regardless of their position or achievements, should be treated the way I treated you this morning. My behavior reflected unconscious biases that have no place in this courtroom or in our justice system. He picked up a document from his bench. I am officially rescinding the contempt fine. Furthermore, I am entering a formal apology into the court record. He looked directly at Sarah again. Miss Richardson, a reputation for grace under pressure is well earned. You maintained absolute professionalism despite my unwarranted behavior. The corporate lawyers were now staring at their table, their earlier smirks long gone. In the gallery, several of the young law students who had witnessed the morning session were frantically taking notes. Your Honor, Sarah finally spoke, her voice clear and dignified. I accept your apology, and if I may, I would like to say something. Judge Bennett nodded. Please do. This moment, right here, right now, is why I love the law, Sarah said, looking around the courtroom. It's not about winning or losing. It's about our capacity to acknowledge our mistakes, to learn from them, and to do better. What Your Honor has just done takes remarkable courage and integrity. A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Judge Bennett felt a weight lift from his shoulders, even as the full impact of this moment sank in. He knew this story would spread through the legal community. But that was good. It needed to be told. Thank you, Miss Richardson, he said. Now, would you like to resume your presentation of evidence without interruption this time? A small smile touched his lips on the last words. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied, picking up her notes. And if I may suggest, what just happened here might be more important than any evidence I could present. James Chen watched this exchange with amazement. In his 15 years of running his small business, he had never seen anything like it. He realized he was witnessing something rare invaluable. A moment of genuine human growth and institutional change happening right before his eyes. The afternoon sun streamed through the high windows of courtroom 304, and for the first time that day, everyone in the room could feel that justice, true justice, was finally being served. 1 month after the memorable day in courtroom 304, the Harris County Courthouse was buzzing with activity. But something was different. Signs posted on bulletin boards announced a new Judicial Fairness Initiative, with Judge Michael Bennett and Sarah Richardson listed as co-chairs. Judge Bennett sat in his chambers, reviewing applications for the courthouse's new mentorship program. 20 young lawyers from diverse backgrounds had applied for the program's first round. On his desk lay a framed newspaper article with the headline, "Local Judge's Public Apology Sparks Change in Legal Community." A knock on his door interrupted his reading. "Come in," he called out. Sarah Richardson entered, carrying a stack of papers. Over the past month, they had met weekly to develop new courthouse policies. The judge stood to greet her, noting how different this felt from their first encounter. "Good morning, Sarah," he said warmly. "How was the Bar Association meeting yesterday?" "Productive," she replied, taking the seat. "Actually, that's why I'm here. Several other courthouses want to adopt our new training program. They've heard about the changes we're making here." The changes she referred to were significant. After that day in court, Judge Bennett had approached Sarah with an idea. Use their experience to create real change in the legal system. To his surprise, she had agreed immediately. "I've been a judge for 15 years, he had told her during the first planning meeting. "But I learned more about justice in those few minutes of public apology than in all those years on the bench." Together, they had created new courthouse policies, mandatory bias training for all judges and court staff, a mentorship program pairing experienced attorneys with young lawyers from underrepresented groups, new guidelines for judges about courtroom conduct and fair treatment, and regular community feedback sessions where people could share their courthouse experiences. The program was already showing results. In the past month, complaints about unfair treatment had dropped significantly. More importantly, young lawyers reported feeling more confident in court, knowing they would be judged solely on their arguments and merit. "Judge," Sarah said, pulling out a particular document, "I want you to see this letter. It's from that young mother I was helping the day I was late to your court." Judge Bennett took the letter and began reading. The woman wrote about how Sarah had saved her and her baby from homelessness that day. She described how she had later watched Sarah argue brilliantly in court, despite unfair treatment, and how the judge's subsequent apology had restored her faith in the justice system. "You know," Sarah said softly, "that morning could have gone very differently. You could have ignored the newsletter, continued as usual, and nobody would have been surprised. But you chose to change. That's why I agreed to work with you on these initiatives." Judge Bennett nodded thoughtfully. "I keep thinking about all the times in the past when I might have done the same thing to other attorneys. How many careers did I affect? How many cases were influenced by my biases?" "The past is past," Sarah replied. "What matters is what we do now." Just then, they heard excited voices in the hallway. A group of law students was gathering for the first session of the mentorship program. Through the open door, Judge Bennett and Sarah could see the diverse group of young faces, all eager to learn and grow in their profession. "You know what the best part is?" Sarah said, watching the students. "These young lawyers won't have to prove themselves. The way I did, though, he judged by their skills, not their appearance or background." Judge Bennett stood up and straightened his robe. He was due in court soon, but it was a different judge who would take the bench today. The harsh, biased man from a month ago had been replaced by someone more aware, more considerate, and ultimately more just. "Ready for court?" Sarah asked, gathering her papers. "Yes," he replied. "But first, I want to sit in on the mentorship session for a few minutes. I think today's young lawyers have as much to teach us as we have to teach them." As they walked toward the training room, both knew that their story would continue to create ripples of change throughout the legal community. What had started as a moment of confrontation had transformed into something powerful. A real chance to make the justice system more just. 1 year had passed since that transformative day in courtroom 304. The Harris County Courthouse looked the same from the outside, but inside, everything had changed. A large framed photograph hung in the main hallway, showing Judge Bennett and Sarah Richardson standing together, smiling under the headline, "Leadership in Legal Reform," 1 year later. On this particular morning, the courthouse's largest conference room was packed. Judges, lawyers, and court officials from across Texas had gathered for the first annual Judicial Fairness Conference. The room buzzed with excitement as Sarah Richardson stepped up to the podium. 1 year ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the room. A simple morning court session turned into something none of us expected. Today, I'm proud to announce that our programs have been adopted by 23 courthouses across Texas. In the front row, Judge Bennett listened with pride. The past year had brought amazing changes. Over 200 young lawyers had completed their mentorship program. Complaints about unfair treatment had dropped by 70%. Their training methods were being studied by courts in other states, and several law schools had added their story to their ethics curriculum. As Sarah continued speaking, the back doors opened quietly. James Chen, the small business owner whose case had brought them all together that fateful day, stepped in. His case had been settled fairly, and he had kept his business. Now, he volunteered as a community advisor for the courthouse's feedback sessions. "The numbers don't tell the whole story," Sarah continued. "The real change is in the daily moments. It's in the young lawyer who feels confident speaking in court for the first time. It's in the client who knows they'll be treated fairly, regardless of their background. It's in the judge who catches themselves making assumptions and chooses to think differently." Judge Bennett stood up next, walking to the podium as Sarah stepped aside. A year ago, this would have felt awkward. But now they had developed an easy friendship built on mutual respect. "When I made the public apology a year ago," he began, "I thought it was the end of something. Instead, it was just the beginning." He paused, looking around the room. "We've written an article together for the Bar Journal about our experience. It's called 'The Day Justice Learned to Listen.'" In the audience, several of the law students who had witnessed the original incident sat, taking notes. They were now junior attorneys, and some had gone through the mentorship program themselves. One of them, Maria Rodriguez, would later tell a reporter that day, showed them that real change is possible, even in the most traditional institutions. The conference continued with workshops and discussions, but the most powerful moment came during the afternoon session. A panel of young lawyers from diverse backgrounds shared their courthouse experiences from before and after the new programs. Last year, one young attorney said, "I was afraid to speak up in court. Now, I know I'll be heard fairly. That changes everything about how I can represent my clients." As the day drew to a close, Sarah and Judge Bennett stood in his chambers, looking out at the courthouse square. The setting sun cast long shadows across the building's stone steps. "Did you ever imagine, Judge Bennett, that one difficult morning would lead to all this?" Sarah smiled. "Actually, I did. That's why I agreed to work with you. I saw someone willing to change, and that's where all real progress begins. On his desk lay a letter from the National Judicial Council requesting them to present their program at next year's national conference. Their story had grown beyond Texas, becoming a model for courts across the country. "You know what makes me most proud," Judge Bennett said, picking up a recent courthouse survey. "New lawyers don't know about that day anymore. They just know this as a place where everyone gets treated with respect." Sarah nodded. "That's exactly how it should be. The best kind of change becomes so normal that people forget things were ever different." As they walked out of the courthouse that evening, they passed the training room where a new group of mentors and mentees were meeting. Through the glass, they could see animated discussions, shared laughter, and the future of the legal profession taking shape. The story of the white judge and the Bar Association president had become more than just a courthouse legend. It had become a catalyst for real change, a reminder that justice works best when it learns to recognize and correct its own mistakes. In the end, that one morning of confrontation had transformed into a legacy of lasting change, proving that sometimes the greatest moments in law happen not in dramatic court victories, but in simple acts of human understanding.